but the righteous cry of a continent long wounded by the dual blades of neglect and exploitation. Let me begin now with defense, but with confession. Yes, the church has, at moments in history, stood beside colonizers, when it should have stood beside the crucified. There were chapters, some long, some shamefully brief, where the mission of salvation became entangled in the machinery of subjugation, where the banner of the cross was hoisted beside flags of empire, and the teachings of Christ were diluted by the ambitions of kings. They were pliable and demonized when they dared to defy unjust systems. Your resources have been extracted while your people were left to scavenge what was theirs to begin with. But Africa is not a charity case. Africa is not a patient waiting for the West to administer spiritual or political anesthesia. Africa is the cradle of courage, the wellspring of song, the pulse of prophecy. It is not the world's burden, it is its teacher. Let me speak plainly, as you did, President Trias, on colonial legacy. President Traore, you spoke of chains not only of those that bound the bodies of our ancestors, but the invisible ones that still clutch at the soul of Africa. Let us speak truth, not as adversaries, but as men burdened with memory. Colonialism was not simply a political conquest, it was a spiritual betrayal. It was not just the theft of land, but the attempted erasure of identity. Entire civilizations, with their poetry, their proverbs, their cosmologies, their sacred rhythms, were silenced under foreign flags and foreign gods. The missionaries, some sincere, came with crosses in one hand, but behind them followed gunboats, traders, and governors with contracts of domination. Baptismal fonts were built next to whips. Scriptures were preached beside swords. The story of Christ who came to liberate was too often retold in the language of control, and though many of those missionaries gave their lives in service, and some stood up to the powers of empire, the broader truth remains: the church did not always stand with the oppressed. Too often it stood with the conqueror. I confess this not as a political calculation, but as a moral reckoning. Because if the church is to truly mirror Christ, then it must weep where Christ would weep. And surely he weeps for what was done in his name on African soil. I have seen the ruins of colonial prisons turned into schools. I have met grandmothers who remember their tribes being renamed. I have watched as young African seminarians ask, is this faith ours, or was it imported? Let me answer clearly, the gospel was never meant to conquer. It was meant to liberate. Christ was never a colonizer. He was a carpenter from Nazareth, brown-skinned, occupied, poor. And so I pledge that under this papacy we will revisit our history, not to dwell in guilt, but to root out denial, not to perform penance with words, but to open doors with justice. The church must become not a reminder of conquest, but a refuge for cultural rebirth. Let the next chapter be one written together by African hands in African languages, and in full ownership of faith that was never truly foreign, but always somehow destined to rise again from African soil. On economic injustice, President Traore, when you speak of blood-stained minerals and hunger in the shadow of gold mines, you are not exaggerating. You are revealing a wound that the world has chosen to dress with silence. Africa is rich, yet too many of her children remain poor. Why so? Because the wealth beneath your soil, cobalt, gold, uranium, coltan, oil, has been turned into a curse, not a blessing. These were supposed to be gifts of providence, not instruments of plunder. But instead of building schools, they have built empires far from the shores of Africa. Let us no longer pretend that economic suffering is accidental. Let us no longer speak of underdevelopment as if it were nature's plan. It was policy, it was greed, it was engineered stagnation, orchestrated debt, and predatory agreements signed in glass towers, while farmers walked barefoot through dust. And yes, While the church itself may not have signed trade deals or drawn oil contracts, it has often been too quiet when it should have cried out, too cautious when it should have stood between the vulnerable and the vultures, too diplomatic when the gospel demanded disruption. There are African nations today where a child cannot drink clean water, but multinationals extract billions from the same land without paying fair dues. There are communities where women give birth in candlelight hospitals, while cargo ships full of precious resources sail out of port, guarded by foreign guns. That is not trade. That is tribute extracted from the wealthy. And this, dear brothers and sisters of the world, is not just an African tragedy. It is a global scandal. It is the failure of